The transatlantic slave trade stands as one of the darkest chapters in human history. It was a brutal system of forced labor that lasted for centuries. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, European powers forcibly transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. These enslaved people were shipped to the Americas. Their labor fueled the growth of plantations and colonies. This trade had a profound impact on the world. It shaped economies, societies, and cultures. The legacy of this trade continues to resonate today. The transatlantic slave trade involved several European colonial powers. The most active were Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Denmark. Each of these nations played a role in the capture, transport, and enslavement of Africans. The trade reached its peak in the 18th century. During this time, millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. The transatlantic slave trade was a complex and multifaceted system. It involved a network of traders, ship captains, plantation owners, and government officials. This trade was driven by greed. It was made possible by the dehumanization of African people. The transatlantic slave trade was a crime against humanity. It left an indelible stain on the conscience of the world. This map illustrates the complex network of trade routes used during the transatlantic slave trade, highlighting the global scale of this horrific enterprise. The journey of enslaved Africans began with their capture in Africa. European slave traders relied on a system of intermediaries to acquire captives. These intermediaries were often African rulers or traders who participated in the trade for their own economic gain. They organized raids and wars to capture people for enslavement. This practice fueled conflict and instability across the continent. Once captured, Africans were forced to march to coastal trading posts. These journeys were often hundreds of miles long. They were characterized by brutality and deprivation. Enslaved people were bound together with chains and ropes. They were forced to walk for days or weeks without adequate food, water, or rest. Many died along the way from exhaustion, disease, or maltreatment. Upon reaching the coast, enslaved Africans were imprisoned in cramped and unsanitary holding cells. They were held there for weeks or months while they awaited transport across the Atlantic. During this time, they were subjected to further abuse and degradation. They were branded with hot irons to mark them as property. They were separated from their families and communities. They were stripped of their names, their identities, and their humanity. This image provides a glimpse into the appalling conditions endured by enslaved Africans during their transatlantic journey, highlighting the inhumane treatment they suffered at the hands of slave traders. The Middle Passage was the most horrific leg of the transatlantic slave trade. It was the journey across the Atlantic Ocean from Africa to the Americas. Enslaved Africans were crammed into the holds of ships. They were chained together with little space to move or breathe. The conditions were appalling. The air was thick with the stench of vomit, urine, and feces. Disease spread rapidly. Mortality rates were high. The journey across the Atlantic took several weeks to several months. During this time, enslaved Africans endured unimaginable suffering. They were given minimal food and water. They were often beaten and whipped by the ship's crew. Many died from disease, starvation, or despair. Those who survived the journey arrived in the Americas traumatized and dehumanized. The Middle Passage was a testament to the cruelty and barbarity of the transatlantic slave trade. It was a journey of unimaginable suffering and loss. It is estimated that as many as 2 million Africans died during the Middle Passage. Their deaths were a direct result of the greed and inhumanity of the slave traders. This image captures the perilous nature of the Middle Passage, emphasizing the constant threat of storms, disease, and death that loomed over enslaved Africans during their transatlantic voyage. The transatlantic slave trade was driven by economics. European powers sought to profit from the exploitation of African labor. The trade was immensely profitable for those involved. It enriched slave traders, ship owners, plantation owners, and European economies as a whole. The slave trade had a significant impact on the economies of European nations. It provided raw materials such as sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee. These goods were in high demand in Europe. They contributed to the growth of European industries and consumer markets. the slave trade also stimulated the growth of shipbuilding, banking, and insurance industries. In the Americas, the slave trade led to the development of plantation economies. These economies were based on large-scale agriculture. They relied heavily on enslaved labor. Plantations produced cash crops for export to Europe. These crops included sugar, cotton, tobacco, indigo, and rice. The profits from these crops were enormous. They fueled the growth of colonial economies and enriched plantation owners. This graph highlights the economic forces that drove the transatlantic slave trade, showing how the demand for enslaved labor fueled the growth of this horrific industry. Section 5. A Cry for Freedom, the Rise of the Abolitionist Movement. As the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade became more widely known, a movement to abolish it gained momentum. This movement was fueled by a growing sense of moral outrage. It drew strength from Enlightenment, ideals of liberty, equality, and human rights. Abolitionists came from diverse backgrounds. They included religious leaders, writers, intellectuals, politicians, and formerly enslaved people. They used a variety of tactics to raise awareness about the evils of slavery and to advocate for its abolition. These tactics included writing pamphlets and books, giving speeches, organizing petitions, and boycotting goods produced by enslaved labor. The abolitionist movement faced fierce opposition from those who profited from the slave trade. Slave traders and plantation owners argued that slavery was necessary for economic prosperity. They claimed that Africans were inferior and suited for manual labor. However, the abolitionists persisted in their fight for justice and equality. They argued that slavery was a moral abomination and a crime against humanity. This image celebrates the courage and determination of abolitionists like Olaudah Equiano, who risked their lives to fight for the freedom of enslaved Africans and expose the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. Section 6. A Beacon of Hope, the Haitian Revolution and its Impact. The Haitian Revolution, which began in 1791, was a major turning point in the fight against slavery. It was the only successful slave revolt in history. It led to the establishment of Haiti as an independent nation in 1804. The revolution was inspired by the ideals of the French Revolution. It was fueled by the determination of enslaved Africans to fight for their freedom. The Haitian Revolution had a profound impact on the transatlantic slave trade. It sent shockwaves throughout the Americas. It inspired hope in enslaved people. It struck fear into the hearts of slave owners. The revolution demonstrated that slavery could be overthrown. It showed that enslaved people were capable of fighting for their freedom and winning. The Haitian Revolution also had a significant impact on the abolitionist movement. It provided a powerful symbol of resistance and hope. It galvanized abolitionists in their fight against slavery. It also challenged the racist assumptions that underpinned the slave trade. The Haitian Revolution showed that people of African descent were capable of self-governance and creating a just society. This image captures the spirit of the Haitian Revolution, highlighting the courage and determination of enslaved Africans who rose up against their oppressors to fight for their freedom and create a new nation. Section 7. Turning the Tide, the Abolition of the Slave Trade. The abolitionist movement gained momentum throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In 1807, Britain passed the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act. This act made it illegal for British subjects to participate in the transatlantic slave trade. This was a major victory for the abolitionist movement. It marked a turning point in the fight against slavery. The United States followed suit in 1808 by banning the importation of slaves. However, the domestic slave trade within the United States continued. It flourished for several more decades. Other European nations soon followed Britain's lead. They abolished the slave trade in the early 19th century. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade was a major achievement. However, it did not end slavery. Slavery continued in the Americas and other parts of the world. The fight for abolition continued for many years after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. This image reflects the growing opposition to the transatlantic slave trade and the changing moral landscape that ultimately led to its abolition. Section 8. A Legacy of Inequality, the Enduring Impact of Slavery. The transatlantic slave trade had a profound and lasting impact on the world. It shaped the demographics, economies, and societies of Africa, Europe, and the Americas. The legacy of this trade continues to resonate today. In Africa, the transatlantic slave trade had a devastating impact. It resulted in the loss of millions of people. It fueled conflict and instability. It disrupted social structures and economic development. The trade also contributed to the underdevelopment of Africa. It left a legacy of poverty, inequality, and political instability. In the Americas, the slave trade led to the establishment of societies built on racial hierarchy and inequality. Enslaved Africans and their descendants were denied basic human rights. They were subjected to centuries of exploitation and discrimination. The legacy of slavery continues to shape racial relations and social structures in the Americas today. This image serves as a reminder that the fight for equality and justice continues long after the formal abolition of slavery, emphasizing the need to address the enduring legacy of racial inequality. Section 9. Systemic racism, the deep scars of slavery. One of the most enduring legacies of the transatlantic slave trade is systemic racism. Systemic racism refers to the ways in which racism is embedded in the laws, policies, and institutions of society. It creates and perpetuates racial inequality. Systemic racism manifests itself in a variety of ways. It can be seen in racial disparities in wealth, income, education, healthcare, and criminal justice. It is also evident in the persistence of racial stereotypes and prejudices. Systemic racism is a complex and pervasive problem. It requires a multifaceted approach to address. It is essential to acknowledge the history of racism and its impact on contemporary society. It is also important to challenge racist attitudes and behaviors, and it is crucial to advocate for policies that promote racial equity and justice. This image provides a visual representation of systemic racism, highlighting the stark disparities that continue to exist between different racial groups in areas such as housing, education, and healthcare. Section 10. Remembering the past, fighting for the future. The transatlantic slave trade was a horrific chapter in human history. It is essential to remember this history and to learn from its mistakes. By understanding the causes and consequences of the slave trade, we can work to prevent similar atrocities from happening again. Remembering the transatlantic slave trade is not just about the past, it is also about the present and the future. The legacy of slavery continues to shape the world we live in today. Racism, discrimination, and inequality are still pressing problems. It is our responsibility to fight for a more just and equitable world for all people. We can honor the memory of the victims of the transatlantic slave trade by fighting for justice and equality in our own time. We can support organizations that are working to combat racism and discrimination. We can educate ourselves and others about the history of slavery and its legacy. And we can use our voices and our actions to create a more just and equitable world. This image symbolizes the importance of remembrance, reflection, and collective action in addressing the legacy of slavery and working towards a more just and equitable future for all. Section 11. Modern slavery, a global challenge. While the transatlantic slave trade was abolished in the 19th century, slavery is far from over. Millions of people around the world are still trapped in various forms of modern slavery. Modern slavery takes many forms. It includes forced labor, debt bondage, human trafficking, child labor, and forced marriage. It is a global problem that affects people of all ages, genders, and backgrounds. There are many factors that contribute to modern slavery. These factors include poverty, inequality, discrimination, conflict, and lack of education. It is a complex problem that requires a multifaceted approach to address. We must all do our part to combat modern slavery. We can support organizations that are working to rescue and support victims of modern slavery. We can educate ourselves and others about the signs of modern slavery. And we can advocate for policies that address the root causes of this crime against humanity. This image serves as a call to action, urging individuals, communities, and governments to join forces in the fight against modern slavery, a global scourge that demands our attention and concerted efforts.